Hello, and welcome to Poetry at the Dalí, hosted by St. Petersburg Poet Laureate Helen Pruitt Wallace. I'm Hank Hine, the museum director, and we're honored to present the first evening of poetry at the Dalí delivered virtually. Now, as you lovers of words know, virtually is now misused because we are not actually together, we are virtually together. Such is the irony of media. Well, William Carlos Williams once wrote that it is difficult to get the news from poetry, but good men and women die each day from lack thereof. Tonight, you will see that this is our thesis, getting the news, and this is our motivation to share essential aspects of our lives together. As is our custom, Poet Laureate Helen Pruitt Wallace will read one of her poems, and then we will continue. She will introduce the Poets Laureates of other cities and the inaugural wordsmith that is also with us tonight. We're going to ask Helen to read that poem and then introduce the poets, and you will enjoy this evening, I am sure. Thank you for being with us, and now please welcome Poet Laureate of St. Petersburg, Helen Pruitt Wallace. Good evening.
Thanks, Hank, especially to you and all the wonderful Dalí staff who work so hard during this time to make sure the museum can continue safely to be the heart of the arts in Tampa Bay. These are certainly surreal times. Thanks to those of you who are tuning in to watch this event, which is the opening of our 4th year of the Dalí Poetry Series. We do come together in words, and we need to now more than ever. Tonight we have 3 wonderful poets who embrace that as part of their mission as Poets Laureate. I'll read one short poem and then have the pleasure of introducing Susan Lilly, Gianna Russo, and Peter Meinke. I wrote this pandemic poem in response to a request from Mayor Kreisman's office. It's called Don't Put the Moon in Your Poem, and the title is also the first line. Don't put the moon in your poem. You'll want to. It's more resilient than you. In the morning, the torn world returns, and the bay is back to its churning. Maybe you're lonely, or something more grips your feral heart. Everything becomes a metaphor. Vines of jasmine choking their stars. The faucet you scrub that won't come clean. Even that spider swinging from what's left of its web. The need for masks begets our own unmasking. Uncertainty is certain. The tipping point wobbles in the wind. Our days depend on sharing grief, joy. Rupture and rapture, look, they're joined at the hip. We shop for hope, fill our empty carts, shuddering at sirens in the distance. Is there an expiration date for prayer? I don't know if you should put them in a poem, but we seek out parrots in the park. They chitter from a palm that lost its fronds in last year's sudden storm. Nuzzling each other, they're wild and insistent with song. While we, masked, stand 6 feet apart. Pretend I take your hand. The world makes sense. Now I have the pleasure of introducing Susan Lilly. Susan is a Florida native and currently serving as Orlando's Poet Laureate, their first Poet Laureate. Her poetry and nonfiction have appeared in American Poetry Review, Gulf Coast, Poet Laureate, the Southern Review, Drunken Boat, and many other magazines. Her two chapbooks are Night Windows and The Satellite Beach. She's a past winner of the Rita Dove Poetry Award and has held a State of Florida Individual Arts Fellowship. She's taught at the University of Central Florida and Rollins College and currently teaches literature and creative writing at Trinity Preparatory School in Winter Park. Her new full collection, Venus and Retrograde, was published spring of 2019 by Borough Press. So good to have you with us, Susan.
Thank you, Helen. I'm so glad to be at the Dalí Museum. If only I were. But no, I am actually in my classroom with garish lighting and possible hysterical interruptions by students. Let's hope not. I love the fact that both Helen and Gianna look like NPR correspondents sitting behind, in front of impressive books, and too bad I couldn't make all that happen. Anyway, it is a delight to be with my fellow Poets Laureate, and we all know that requires a strong sense of connection to our place. Central Florida is my place, and the city of Orlando has enabled me to, I hope, put a little more poetry in front of people. And it's exciting. If you go to the city's website, the City of Orlando's website, as of yesterday, they posted the results of a poetry contest for summer that we held in our area. And oh, we got some really beautiful poems. So I thought I would read a seasonal poem myself. This is an older poem. It was one of the ones that appeared in Night Windows, which is a chapbook I'm very proud of because it was published by Yellow Jacket Press. And Gianna Russo is the queen of that particular queendom. Anyway, this is a poem that I wrote about my son when he was very small, and it's about, early September. Of course, he is now fulfilled the things I wished for in this poem with a big life full of adventures. But at the time, they were all my hopes and dreams. So it's called River in September. We twirl like the centers of flowers, daisies in a child's hands, over black inner tubes, bloom down the slow bottle green river. I lean back over the warm rubber and inhale my grief for summer, holding it tight in my chest. It's hot, but the new season whispers in the trees and in the colder depths where our feet dangle. You scan the undulating surface into the reflected banners of sweeping moss, hoping for gators or snakes, as Florida boys do. We've been talking about the past. You are twice the age I was when the kindergarten gate swung back too far and smashed my forehead. You love that story. How the pretty gate with the wrought iron children walking across the top caught me. You could just see the blood all over the little iron girl, her skirt a black bell dotted with red, and how all the boys said, I look like World War III. You can't imagine me that small, just like I can't imagine you with any bad habits. Still, you already have a few stories of your own to tell. But I can't cap you up, keep out the world's litter that blows through souls like a public park after Labor Day. I wish hard as we slowly leave, tires crunching the sweet brown needles. For you, a big life with true stories, a beautiful life, messy and sanctified. He's like both my children, he's embarrassed when I read poems about him, but He secretly loves it. Maybe he'll watch this video. And because we're starting school, I'm actually at school with live students, which during a pandemic is bizarre, but some things never change. And I wrote this poem not too long ago, but it's sort of an ode to high school students. It's called Unit Test on Romanticism. Wordsworth's prison gates of adulthood have not closed upon these 16-year-olds yet, who fly through paper tasks like they play baseball or tennis or volleyball, like something must be won. Nicole, the cross-country runner in the front row, bites her pencil hard and ruffles through the poets in her head before bending to write. Evan, shining from lunchtime basketball, crams his long legs into the molded plastic desk to declare in 3 blue book pages that nature is the best teacher, that he knows personally the loneliness Wordsworth swam in that day of the daffodils. Mandy must be stoned again. Her eyes reflect the blank page like mirrors, but she is seized with an idea and begins a languid parrot green outline for an essay on Keats. The questions they want are not on this test, yet they find a way to answer. Science equals murder, I knew it all along. Shelley hated England the way I hate my parents' country club. Who wants to fade with the nightingale into the forest dim? Mandy says, I do. It's always fun to teach the romantics to kids who are just at the right age to soak it up. In fact, that's when I became an English major. It was in 11th grade. I can almost pinpoint the day. Reading Ode to a Nightingale, and I was absolutely struck by Cupid's bow. And that was it for me. It was poetry and literature all the way. Let's see. I have time for 2 more, I think. This poem is called The Lords of Front Street. It takes place in Key West because I had to get evacuated from Key West for a hurricane once, and I never realized how weird it would be to have so little space to get out along with everyone else. There's one road. So this was an interesting experience, and it was interesting to watch that town change completely in a matter of a few hours. The Lords of Front Street. These men clabbering like low-pressure clouds at the doorways of miniature groceries gather their lives into sacks, whistle to their familiars, dogs better fed than their masters, swing onto ragged bicycles and pedal silently across their slanted world. Romantic names on rusted street signs, Olivia, Petronia, webs of skinny streets angled between the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, a dream of Cuba glimmering to the south. Although the hurricane is coming, these scarecrows casually skim the top of the foamy tide of panic that flows frankly down every alley and palmetto-crowded lane in Key West. The sun here can melt a whole lipstick in 3 minutes. Tomorrow, the wet howling will bend palms like pipe cleaners and shred the hopeless table umbrellas, now primly belted like white dresses. Outside Five Brothers Grocery, one man with a plume beard and skin the color of cordovan polish pulls up on a bicycle to speak to another. I'm supposed to be in court on Monday. The birds are already gone, and I remind myself that we can pack up and get out, inch across the 7-mile bridge, past gas lines and homemade signs cursing the storm, or welcoming her with a party. But where will these men go? As we leave town, I see 3 of them together, wind furling their long gray ponytails and white-capped beards, a tableau, like fishermen in a child's Bible, staring out to sea for a sign. And the last poem I'm going to read is one in a series that's still not finished, called Venus in Retrograde. And each of these poems has the title Venus in Retrograde with a subtitle. And this is another school poem. Venus in Retrograde, Student Conference. Maybe it's just bad timing, kid, but no, I will not review your paper for a higher grade. And while we're at it, what is it with all these frogs singing in the coffee-making dark, and the shit on my shoe at the mailbox by the road, and the overflow in the plumbing somewhere beyond the walls, the Ides of March and the oceans of the moon and the wide sedated valleys between the first 15 minutes of love and the denouement, years all spread under glass like paralyzed centuries. All those guitar strings and river rocks, late dinners and dog walks, a whole museum vibrating under my feet. You don't know what I'm talking about, do you? Didn't think so. See you in class.
Thank you, Susan. Those were terrific, and I love the title of your book. So after all the poets have read, we are going to have a discussion about poems. You know, usually when we're in the theater, we have a Q&A, and the audience, those of you in the audience, participate, and you've been terrific about your questions. We're a little more restricted with this virtual format, but we will have a conversation among us about writing, about the books, and one of the things I want to ask you about, Susan, is where your title came from. A little bit more about it. I think it's so intriguing. So thank you for that wonderful reading. Next we have Gianna Russo. Gianna is the inaugural wordsmith of the city of Tampa. Gianna, congratulations.
Thank you so much. I'm excited.
She is the author of the poetry collections One House Down by Madville Publishing, Moonflower, winner of a Florida Book Award, and she's published poems in Green Mountain Review, Gulfstream, Negative Capability, Crab Orchard Review, Appalachia Review, and many more journals. She is assistant professor of English and creative writing at St. Leo University and is currently serving as St. Leo's inaugural poet in residence for the College of Arts and Sciences and for the scholarly journal Rebus. A third-generation Tampa native, Gianna lives in an almost 100-year-old bungalow with her poet husband, Jeff Karen, and their cat, Ginkgo. So welcome, Gianna.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Director Hank Hine for allowing this wonderful poetry program to continue, and to everybody at Dalí that has helped to put this together. And thanks to those of you that are tuning in on YouTube. I think it's really cool that we're going to be living out there for a little bit. So my book, One House Down, came out in October, and I had heard of this phenomenon from other poets, maybe not Peter because he's so prolific and he has so many books, but other poets had talked about feeling sort of at a loss when a big project comes to fruition and you've celebrated it and it's now out in the world. And I have really felt that way for, probably the last year. And I've been fishing around for kind of another project, but also just some direction of where I wanted to go. And I started a few poems. Well, I've started a number of poems over this last year, and a lot of them just fizzled out, and I kind of put them aside or abandoned them or whatever. And then the pandemic happened. So I have mined that a little bit, and I think I'll continue to do that. So I'm going to read a couple of pandemic poems and one sort of current events / politics type poem. The first poem is called Pandemic Pantoum, and a pantoum is a form of poetry that has repeated lines, so you're going to hear those lines happening. This was written Memorial Day of this year, started at that time, and it's really a poem about not wallowing. My family has been relatively, well, very, very fortunate during the pantoum. We have stayed healthy and we have not lost any members of our immediate family. We're all doing okay. So I know that we're in a really great position compared to so many, of our fellow Americans. But even with that, sometimes I found myself getting a little bit down. So this is a poem about that. It's called Pandemic Pantoum. I watched last night as the numbers rose and rose. With a granite-eyed stare in my mirror, I told myself to buck up. As the numbers rose and rose, helplessness clawed at my gut, at my mirror. I told myself to buck up, but that didn't work too well. Helplessness clawed at my gut. I tried baking a cake, sewing a mask. That didn't work too well. Neither did joyful postings on Facebook. I tried baking a cake, sewing a mask. How many ways can you spell distraction? Or post something joyful on Facebook? I metaphorically slapped myself. How many ways can you spell distraction? N-A-T-U-R-E. And I win the B. I metaphorically slapped myself. Get your hands dirty. Do for others. N-A-T-U-R-E and I. Wind and the bees. Social distancing drone on and on. Get your hands dirty. Do for others. Get out of yourself, for God's sakes. Social distancing drones on and on. With a granite-eyed stare, my mirror repeats, get out of yourself, for God's sakes. For God's sakes, get out of yourself.
Wow.
Okay, now the next poem, this was fun. This is a little kind of a research poem, and it's called Merriam-Webster Explains the Meaning of My Isolation. Merriam-Webster as in the dictionary. So the research I did was, you're going to hear it. You're going to hear in the poem everything that Merriam-Webster told me about my isolation. It starts off actually with a quote from the dictionary. So you'll hear where that ends. After the long book tour, the author looked forward to the isolation of his office, is the first example of how isolation is used in a sentence. Then synonyms and antonyms. But I am not a he, and the book tour was canceled. Instead, I'm staying at home, sequestered. It is not like exile, Napoleon, or Neruda. In some ways, it feels like withdrawal. And this poem is in quarantine. Potholders scrunch into my seclusion. Now I've become an eating machine. I can't stop gnawing at solitude. I want to zoom out of this confinement like a woman giving birth. I want to knock elbows and bump knuckles so as not to feel utterly alone. There are fitted sheets to tuck into my aloofness. There are supermoons to fill the vacuum. I say, drink, bring me drink. Lonesomeness is the worm. So this is I'm going to go ahead and call it a political poem. And the title is a sentence that if you pay any attention at all to national politics, You'll remember hearing it, and it has gotten repeated many, many times since it was first uttered. The sentence is, and some, I assume, are good people. That ring a bell with anybody? And some, I assume, are good people. My student sits beside me. After we look at her grades, she tells me her parents are without papers. They just came to make something better, she says. They've never done one bad thing. This daughter was born in Plant City and knows only this first world. Her father hops into a truck bed before daylight to work on America's lawns. Her mother tailors other people's clothes and is afraid to leave the house. This daughter, my student, tells me no person should be illegal. Another student tells me about Iraq, the IEDs, the tanks. The GI Bill paid for his class. But then he says, my mother and I are undocumented. We stare mutely at each other. But we let you serve, I ask. Yes, because he came before the age of 16. We stare mutely at each other, both knowing what this country can do, even though he held our rifles, even though he unfurled our flag. I stand with my Mexican daughter-in-law. She has the eyes of the Indians. She also has a Ph.D. Her mother went into the mountains above Nayarit and brought me an unfurling bloom of beads to adorn my neck, vibrant as summer fire, delicate as honeycomb. It takes the Huishal Indians 2 weeks to make one such flower necklace. I stand with my daughter-in-law. She is strong as hot stone. She's trying to become a citizen. Her mother went into the mountains above Nayarit and brought me sandals made by the Huishal to pretty up my ugly feet. She brought me bead blossoms to dangle from my ears in a spill of hibiscus. The beadwork is a flood of dazzled pink and as fine as skin. Okay. One more little poem, I think, and I'll have used up my time. Well, Helen started by talking to us about not putting a moon in our poem. And I wish I'd heard her earlier because I picked a poem that has a moon in it. But I also I'm breaking one of my own rules, which is a rule I set for myself probably 20 years ago, with a poem called No More for the Moon. And in that poem, I'm talking to my fellow poets about, hey, let's drop this moon business. There's too many moons in poems and it's cliched and it's way too much. No more for the moon. This is the first moon poem I've written since then. And with apologies to Helen, I'm going to read it. It's called Ode to Supermoons During a Plague. In any given year, there could be at least 3 of you. But in this, the year of our plague, you converged on us in an orderly quartet. February, March, April, May. 4 spectacles in Farmer's Almanac names. Oh, hunger moon, worm moon, pink moon, flower moon, you peaked like this awful plague is peaking, still there, one night to the next. Your Algonquin names call out the pink flocks, hunger and bone, crow and sap, egg and sugar, planted corn, sprouting grass. Your names mean fertility in the midst of this death. Silver, yellow, snow white, or blonde, you are flying in your perigee. You are lounging in elliptical longitude. You are opposite our sun, exactly 180 degrees. I stand in my spangled, solitary yard, enrobed in your glinting energy. It's after midnight. The whole world is unlit. Oh, flower moon, milk moon, mother moon, you're the last supermoon in this trembling year. We're as close to each other as we'll ever get. Thank you so much, everybody.
Gianna, you should never apologize for that poem. That was wonderful. No, that was terrific, and thank you for that good reading. Next, we have Peter Meinke. Peter's latest book is Tasting Like Gravity, published by the University of Tampa Press in 2018. He's published 8 poetry books in the Pitt Poetry Series, along with award-winning fiction and nonfiction. He serves as the State Poet Laureate, the Poet Laureate of Florida, and his artist wife, Jeannie Clark, has illustrated so many of his books. Welcome, Peter. Thank you for being part of this.
Thank you, Helen. And am I up yet? I don't see myself.
You are up.
Oh, there I am. Okay. I'm delighted to be here, surrounded by younger laureates who stay up past 10 and continue writing. It's a delight for me to be here with you. And I wasn't going to read this poem, but after the discussion about that John and Susan had about the moon in June, and I thought I would begin with this one, which has the same lesson. I told my classes, there are some things you can't do, though, because it's been done so much. You can never, for example, write a poem that has June and moon, both together. And of course, as soon as I said that, I began to write one that might do that. So here is a poem called Miss Arbuckle. Miss Arbuckle taught language arts. She hit her lips against her teeth. Her bottom, like the ace of hearts, was guarded by the Virgin Queen. Miss Arbuckle wore thick-soled shoes, blue dresses with white polka dots. She followed and enforced the rules, what she was paid to teach. She taught. She said that Wordsworth liked the woods, that Blake had never seen a tiger, that Byron wasn't always good, but died in Greece, a freedom fighter. She gave her students rigid tests, and when the schools let out in June, she painted rings around her breasts and danced by the light of the moon. That was fun to work that in. You know, when I got up this morning, I looked at my notes, which are always unreadable, and but I had Dalí, and I had on the underline somehow it said self and other. I don't know where that came from, but I thought the poems were supposed to be about self and other or something, or it could have been a note to myself. But
you're right.
So I've done some of that sort of thing. So the next poem I'm going to read takes me back to Brooklyn, and I started writing this poem when I opened a piano book that we had in our house. And my mother was a piano teacher, and I book opened just because it had been turned to that page, to the page Minuet in G with Beethoven, referring to Beethoven in this piece. And well, I'll just read the poem. Minuet in G. I was going to say, I guess I continue. One of the reasons I like titling this, when I look at it, it looks like minuetting. And poets sort of like the way things look on the page as well as sound. Certain melodies can break your heart just seeing them on the page. Their plump ovals bobbing like seagulls on the surface of some moonless tide. And this bent corner conjures the broad hand of Mr. Herbert, whose crescented thumbnail seemed wide as my wrist when he pressed it down, saying, "Next week, Peter, we make acquaintance with Mr. Ludwig van Beethoven." My mother hovering, tugging her slender fingers as if to say, "Bro, Peter, you can do it. Concentrate." while outside my friends whooped, slapping a tennis ball against our stoop. Mr. Herbert murmuring legato, legato, and I dreaming gondoliers and black-haired women with shadowy cleavage leaning from balconies, singing my name, Pietro, Pietro. The notes on their frail stems still skittering in clusters down the yellowing page, like children playing 3 steps to Germany in Brooklyn, one December evening, 1941. I'll move to St. Petersburg and a poem that's proper for these days with all its noise and rain, thunder. And this is a poem. Jeannie and I are in the Tampa airport, and our son, we haven't seen in a while, he's been away for a long time, is held up. The plane is held up in a circle while the storm clears, and we're, I guess, maybe at the bar waiting for the plane to get clearance. It's called Spanish Moss. Storm shaken, your plane circles on hold over Tampa Bay. We know, but don't say, the lightning center of America. Bolts whack the runway like a judge's gavel, drinks rock on the table. Modern, we're too shy to pray, so we talk about Spanish moss, how it gets wet and heavy in the rain, pruning our oak trees. When we get home, holding you safe between us, branches will twist knee-deep around the house, the moss clump like seaweed on our, have you changed? Have you grown? Are you frightened? Do you love us? When you were young, you liked to be scared by the moss coiling under the moon along the snaky live oak limbs, how your eyes widened when the wind roiled the bay by our house. And we would explain lightning, the negative charge from a cloud leaping to the positive charge of its shadow at how many million feet per second, the flash beating the rumble because light races faster than, are you happy? Is she with you? Are you healthy? Did you miss? We are 6 years older, practicing for death, the ultimate diet. No more cheesecake, no more chocolate, no more fat, alcohol reserved for stress and celebration. And since this is both, I believe I'll have another. Spanish moss doesn't really kill trees. The bald moss is worse. The hanging kind just blocks the sun. You can spray it with liquid copper, but that stuff can, where is that plane? Is the pilot sober? When we outgrow this trembling, will you remember? And 2 more little poems, one little anyway. This is a poem about the Irish side of the family, McDonald's. We had, doesn't tell real stories about them, but this is the side of the family that there are lots of stories about. This is a very short rondo called Irish Whiskey. I've liked to drink since I was 10. A sip of whiskey in the den with Grandma and her sisters, who played pinochle and games of clue, killing time without their men. From County Cork and Monaghan, their husbands sailed and worked, and then soon and sooner, off they flew. They liked to drink. Grandma loved me hard, so when she saw the trouble I was in, she hugged me till my face went blue, but gave me no advice. She knew. She said a prayer. I said, amen. We like to drink. And I'll get to a slightly newer poem, not that old. Last poem, because I'm someone who stays awake a long time. And this is Night Wandering at 80. After reading poems until my eyes burn red, with explosive flashes that do not bode well, each night in bed I lose control, a psychopath, not counting sheep, but headlines, thinking of war, beauty, and you right here, and whether all beauty is poetry and all poetry math, and seeing lines of poems slide by on feet, both visible and auricular, like nursery rhymes with little lambs and boats gently down the stream. Increasingly dyslexic, last night I thought Jack and the Stalkbean, which I actually prefer. See, the Stalkbean step along the path where Maori rocking birds take their morning maths. When you're 100 and I am 103, will we still be we, or just still be? Or will we just be still? When I was young in Brooklyn, I yearned to be tall and straight with an eye that could count the stitches on a fastball over the plate. And later, but not now, with the teams down here for spring training, one of my students stared out the window at the field, flat as a lake. So I yelled, "Pay attention, Charlie." And he said, "Geez, Professor, yesterday I got a hit off Seaver." But I'm still awake while the dragon wars drag on like a low-grade fever. Thank you very much.
Wow. Peter, thank you for that fabulous reading. You know, you have helped so many poets, you know, throughout Florida, not just in our area, and really throughout our whole country. And I feel like you are truly a national treasure, and we're just so lucky to have you in Florida. So thank you, as always, for your words and how you deliver them. You know, what a great reader you are.
Well, yeah, I was going to say one thing is that I meant to tell you, but at the end, people won't remember who was Seaver. That, of course, it rhymes with fever, which is why I used it. But Tom Seaver was a great, great pitcher for the Mets when the Yankees came down to play Eckerd College in spring training, and he just died. So he was just back in the paper. So you've seen Tom Seaver a couple of days ago. So that was, I was going to say it was in his honor, but I forgot. See, I don't remember.
Well, that was terrific. And I want to say that you are exactly right when you zeroed in on the idea of sin and other. We have chosen that as our loose theme for the poetry series this year. And so, but when we give our poets a theme to play around with, we don't mean to tie their hands. We want you to use the theme as metaphorically or not at all, you know, and choose poems that may reflect that. So you're right on board with that. And we are going to transition now into our dialogue part of our program. And I want to first do a shout out for Alsace Wellington, who is the owner of Tombolo Books. She is selling all the books by these poets. You can go to her website, tombolo.com. And thank you, Alsace, for all of your help in promoting this program and your good work here in St. Pete. It's a terrific bookstore. If you haven't been there and you're from our area, please drop by Tombolo Books. Okay, let's start with some questions, and I'm going to start out, and then if you all will ask each other questions for the next several minutes, that would be terrific. And you can say who you might be directing the question to, or say if you mean for it to be for everybody. But I'm going to start us out because it's dawned on me in this program that really you are all, and maybe I include myself in this, you are poets of place. And it comes across in your books, it comes across in your poems. But I love how you also weave in such real people. The poems are never strictly descriptive of place. They always weave in some part of the community, it seems to me, or often. So I am kind of interested in the idea of how you might think about place, and to what extent do you think place reflects who you are, or maybe even constructs or has constructed who you've become as a person and as a poet. Could you each talk a little bit about the role of place in your poems? So, and let's start off. Gianna, do you mind starting us?
Oh, no, I don't mind at all. Great question. I feel that you just used the word, how has it constructed who we are as poets? And for me, I feel that reality is becoming more and more so for me, partly because I'm a Tampa native. I've lived in Tampa my entire life. I've never lived anywhere else. I've traveled, but I've never lived anywhere else. I'm sort of an oddity in that way. And it's only been maybe in the last 5 years that I've decided to completely embrace my Tampa-ness. And so I've been getting into, historical photos, and I've been doing some research, and I've been looking further back in my own family history. And I feel now that it is so much a part of me that I can't even untangle the strands to say what is and what isn't, but it's just who I am. I don't know if that's the right answer, but anyway, that's my answer.
Right answer. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Susan, do you mind adding on to that or answering in your way?
No, not at all, because again, like Gianna, I'm a Florida native. My parents were born in Orlando. And then it goes back, even further than that on one side. And before that, it was Georgia and Alabama. I guess ever since I got my 23andMe or whatever, whatever DNA test I took, they can actually connect you with, certain groups of people who go way back. And it kind of is very affirmative to me about my feeling of connection with the place of Florida. I also have lots of nuanced feelings about it, which are that, not all of this history is good. My grandmother grew up in Lake County. If you've read Devil in the Grove, you might know about, the terrible racism that was so prevalent there. I remember my granny talking about this Sheriff Willis McCall and saying, "Don't get on his bad side, whatever you do." They would talk about it. And I was a kid, I didn't really understand what was going on. Now, looking back on all that, I see that, people who look back on earlier Florida as some kind of idyllic, tropical wonderland, I just don't see it that way at all. I see a lot of improvement over the years and owning up, and also, then there's the inevitable sense of loss of too much development and the destruction of some of the natural beauty. So I think a bit of all of that goes into my view of the place. But I think you made a good observation that it's all about how it affects the people, and I think it has a lot to do with my consciousness, definitely, and how I see the world. I can almost, when I'm walking around certain places in Florida, I can almost feel layers beneath my feet of what has been, native peoples, all that kind of stuff. And I'm so glad you brought up this question, because that's one of the things I was going to ask Gianna about, I know she writes so much about place, especially lately. The book, the recent book, is so much about Tampa and all of it. I just love it so much, and it's so. I mean, it's like a travelogue as well as a beautiful book of poetry. But I wondered if sometimes when you write about place a lot, is it easier to see that place when you're in the middle of it? Like in Gianna's case, is it easier to write about Tampa when you're sitting on your back porch, or when you might be taking a retreat in the mountains or something, and then you can see it from afar? You know, that's always kind of a question we ask ourselves about, would we see more clearly at a distance or up close? And I would love for both of them to tell me what they think about that.
Good question.
Yeah, it is.
Peter, what do you think about that?
Well, it is. I'm agreeing. It's a great question. And everything that John and Susan said is right. It's complicated for me, but because I think poets they carry their places around with them. I think Susan was saying something about that. So, for example, I've been in Florida for 66, so it's over 50 years. But I was born in Brooklyn in 1932, very close to Bernie Sanders, but a little ahead of him. But I thought of myself as a Brooklyn person. I still remember in this Brooklyn area that I grew up in, the high schools. I remember the playgrounds, the roller skate. I remember it all extraordinarily vividly. And so wherever I was, I thought of myself as a Brooklyn poet. And then all of a sudden I'm here and I'm listed as a Southern poet, here, and a Florida poet. And it probably took me 25 years of living in St. Petersburg and getting into our house, which settled us down. We have a very nice house, as you know, and it kind of got us to when Jeannie found this house, it gave me a stronger sense of place than I would have otherwise. So now I am a Florida poet, I think. But it is, I think poets carry their idea of place around. And I believe that Emily Dickinson, who stayed in her house, in Amherst her whole life, I think partially it's one reason she wrote these little poems too. She in a house and writing these short poems and I think if her father had let her, she would have gone traveling in Paris and the poems might have gotten longer. But that's a different story. But anyway, place is important. Yeah.
Gianna, did you want to add anything about place also, or would you rather ask a different question?
Well,
whatever you prefer.
I'd like to respond to Susan's question because, everything everyone's saying is really interesting. For me personally, I am a very oral sort of poet. So if I hear things, or if I hear, I hear clips of speech, or I hear certain sounds or whatever, those things I really key into, as well as images, visual images. So when I'm someplace else, I am enchanted and magnetized by what I'm hearing and seeing there. And so for me, as a Tampa poet and a Florida poet, it's easier for me to write when I'm here. Sorry about that. So, I think that's a real interesting idea to bring up. I like to walk around Tampa and my neighborhood. I like to drive around. I like to stop and look. I like to kind of mentally compare like Tampa and St. Pete, because I do go to St. Pete a lot, and kind of do those little mental comparisons. I like to go to other people's houses and do mental comparisons. Oh, this is how that's laid out, or this is how that is. I like also to hear from all kinds of people about what they think about that place. And so when Susan was talking about the layers of history, that's what's really fascinating to me now. And of course, we are confronting that in a real pivotal way across the nation, but particularly here in the South and in Florida. what's our history? What's gone before us? What sorts of foundations have been laid down for certain justices and injustices? What are we going to say about it? It's all really fascinating to me. And then again, the natural world, I didn't read any nature poems, but that's a fascination too with place. So I hope that answers your question, Susan. I thought it was a good thing to ask. I'm wondering what Peter thinks about that.
Well, I agree entirely. As I said, that it's important. And I found out some sort of odd things because I think most poets like to travel. Even Emily Dickinson would have, I think, if she were allowed. But we spent often years at a place because we took students there, and that's how we got to travel without paying any money. We lived in Switzerland for a year because we had students. But in Switzerland, I did write, but I wasn't writing about Switzerland. But when we came home, I wrote a long poem, Lines from Neuchâtel. I wrote that here, not there. And I think I've done the same thing when we've stayed in London and Paris and Poland. I tend to take notes while I'm there and write other poems, but then it takes me a little while to really explain what I feel about the particular place. And so that's when the Neuchâtel poems all were written in Florida.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm the same way. I think I like a little bit of distance. So actually going to another location can sometimes help me as well when I'm writing about place. Let's move on to other questions that you guys might have for each other.
I have a question. Since I'm a newbie, and by the way, I just wanted to clarify that I'm not technically the Poet Laureate of Tampa. I'm the wordsmith. And in my mind, that means that I'm working across the creative writing spectrum. So we're not going to, I haven't started any projects yet for the city. We do have a few that we've talked about, but it won't just be poetry. So I'm happy to be part of the group, but I just wanted to clarify that. So here's my question, since I'm the newbie, and first Peter and then the two of you I'd like to hear from. What can you share with us sort of an enchanting or wonderful moment that came to you in your role as Poet Laureate?
I'm sure I could, and I'm what you call an old bee, because not only have I been here a long time, I was supposed to be finished with this, and it seemed kind of flexible. Somebody's lax on the other end of when the thing's in, so somehow I've gone well a couple of years past my time. But probably the most moving thing I did was I read with the Parkland students after the massacre there. And someone had the idea that NPR had the idea I should write about that. And I said, okay. And that got her, anyway, Parkland, then they asked me to come read there. And I read with some of the students. And the whole thing was enormously emotional. And what I thought of was not so much what I wrote, which I did write about Parkland, but the parents and the brothers and the students were all there. And what I came from that meeting thinking was that the poetry really is important. I mean, this is where America doesn't think much about poetry, I think, but we do know, and all Americans think, when something really important, when they get married or something big in 9/11, people start writing poetry. And this was an experience of the whole town and school, city were thinking poetry. It was extraordinarily intense, and people would come up and answer the poems, and the students read, and one father got up and he could hardly read because he was crying, and he didn't know his son wrote poetry or even read poetry. And then after he died in that massacre, he was going through his son's notebooks and found some poems.
Wow.
He got up and read them. Well, that was, just the way poetry works. It was both wonderful and very hard, yes.
Mm.
That's incredible.
Yeah, wow. Yeah. Mm. Well, that's hard to follow because that must have just been really an extraordinary event to read for that group. and I've heard your poems about that, and they're just so moving. I would say, as Poet Laureate of St. Petersburg, maybe two things. First of all, I've been just really honored to be able to be the host for this series at the Dalí Museum, and I'm so grateful to the museum and to Dr. Hank Hein for being so supportive of the poetry program, and to all the staff, because it requires a lot of work. And so I feel like the audience, though, for the program, we get a lot of return people, and many of you, I hope, may be tuned in now listening to us. And please know that we have missed you. We have missed your presence. And we look forward to eventually being able to be back into the theater and hope that we'll see you there again. So that has been a lot of fun, and it has something to do with the cross-section of the arts, being able to be in that space with the amazing art. And to me, that's always where magic happens, is when you have the cross-section of arts. So I love that. But I also want to do a shout out. One of my favorite activities that I've been involved in for the last 4, maybe 5 years, I've been a judge for Poetry Out Loud. And that is just an amazing program for high school students from all over. And the talent in that room, some of you all, I know, Peter, you've been a judge also for that, and it's just so rewarding, the talent in the room when those kids stand up and recite poems. Now, they're reciting poems by other poets, but that doesn't matter, because you can still feel the fire they have for poetry. And no doubt there are going to be some fine poets that end up publishing their work as a result of that program. And that's sponsored by the Florida Humanities Council. And it's just a terrific program. So that's been really gratifying to be part of that in my role as Poet Laureate. So, Susan.
Oh, well, my 3 years is supposed to be up next month, but like Peter, somehow it's going to roll into a little more time. Frankly, the search was going to happen during the beginning of the summer, but it's just not a time for something like that. You know, it's hard for people to manage, maybe even apply. It's just they just thought it was not the perfect time to do a search for the next Poet Laureate of Orlando. So they asked me, and I agreed to do another year, which is great, because I feel, in a way, since this is a new program in Orlando, I'm finally getting my feet and figuring out things that will actually work in public spaces. For instance, I curated a poetry exhibit for the airport, Orlando International Airport, and we kind of did a reach. I asked some poets, but then I asked for connections for different voices from different neighborhoods, different ages. We have some youth poets. We have a wonderful poem honoring the first Black aviators in Florida from a woman in Sanford who has been storytelling and doing activism all her life. And, I just made all these new discoveries. And found poets in my own. I thought I knew every poet in Central Florida. Well, it turns out lots of people are writing poetry. And so I'm discovering that I can give them, their voices, more exposure. So that's been really fun. I also was able to write a couple of poems for the mayor of Orange County and Buddy Dyer, the mayor of Orlando, and Jerry Demings is the mayor of Orange County, when they came together to do a commemoration of the Pulse massacre. And it's just horrible that we have to talk about poetry and massacres. I mean, but essentially, Peter's right. There are certain times that poetry is the right voice. And I was able to somehow write a poem for each of them that they could, in honoring the survivors and the first responders. And it was a beautiful event. It was all virtual. And I thought, oh, how good can it be virtual? But it was wonderful. And I was really honored to be included and to have poetry included. Those are probably the highlights for me.
Great. Wonderful. I don't know how in the world you all were able, but it's a testament to your skill and your devotion to poetry that you all were able to craft poems about such horrific situations. I'm in awe. I'm utterly in awe.
Yeah, my first response is always, I can't possibly do that. And then something hits me and starts growing.
And I have found one thing that has helped me when I get started on something, terrible, some awful tragedy or massacre, and I write all how I feel about it. It's all this mess, and it's not any good, and it's like free verse. And I write a lot of free verse, but this is not the right thing. And I found gradually, as I went through having to do this over time, that I could write about these things much better, I think, formally. The form got me to control my slobbering outrage and to tighten it up and make it so that I could at least handle it. I don't know how it really worked, but that's how I finished it, yes.
No, I think absolutely, Peter, and
Great idea.
That compression somehow of those feelings into some sort of vessel, I think just adds power to the grief that you're expressing. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we probably need to conclude our program. You guys have been terrific. Thank you, poets, for joining us. Susan, Lilly, Gianna Russo, and of course, Peter Meinke. Thank you so much. And our next program will be October 8th. We will have the poets Jeannie Larson and Lola Haskins with us, and we hope those of you who've been able to tune in will come back and be with us again. And until then, please be well and be safe. And again, thank you to the Dalí Museum for the Dalí Poetry Series. Bye, you guys.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.